In any case, I'm Steve Weiland. I'm from Michigan State University. I teach in a graduate program in higher education. Our task, the way I think of it, is to educate university administrators. Most of our students think that we train them. And I think based on our interactions with these days with college administrators, they do seem more trained than educated. But I teach in an academic program. I spent about half my career in English and English departments and American Studies programs. That's important for our presentation because we've organized this in two parts. I'm going to offer a little overview of the ITHAKA studies with accents reflecting my biases on behalf of the faculty and my academic experience. Jennifer Dean, who's from University of Detroit Mercy, will take the librarian's perspective on the ITHAKA reports. And simply dividing it that way, I guess, is something of a statement about how we see these ITHAKA studies. By and large, they've been neglected by the faculty. I think that's a terrible mistake on the part of faculty across the departments not to pay attention to this work. So we're trying to restore some attention to the ITHAKA studies by the faculty here. But I wanted to begin, though, by just noticing that our account of the ITHAKA study of research practices is also it's a tribute to ITHAKA. That's simply the way we feel about it. Particularly Roger Schoenfeld, who launched the studies in 2012 and wrote the first group of them, or wrote or co-wrote the first group, and he's remained a guiding force with the studies of changing research practices. The studies constitute a unique resource for understanding the situation of scholars and scientists and roles for librarians in making their work more satisfying and useful. Now, I'm also going to lean on Roger's work. A few years ago, he published a piece called Meeting Researchers Where They Start. And both Jennifer and I think this is an important part of understanding the rationale for the ITHAKA studies and, to a degree, understanding where they wind up, with a very strong focus on individual scholars, on the idiosyncrasies of changing research practices, as much on the general patterns they display. So we know where the scholars aren't, right? They're not at the library. That's the University of Washington library. Now, the reading room is probably never completely empty like that, but you very rarely see faculty members in the large, big universities in the reading room. So if they're not in the reading room, so where are they? Well, that's Cass Sunstein in his University of Chicago office about 15 years ago. There's a wonderful piece. It's in the list, the bibliography you can pick up later. The University of Chicago Alumni Magazine did a feature early in the 2000s on the messiest offices on campus. And Sunstein's was one of the winners. If you get close, you can see the Kit Kat wrappers on the floor and a couple of spare ties and so on. Now, this is the kind of office that would drive most librarians crazy, right? If they were eager to pursue the information management practices of individual scholars. Of course, the irony in this is that Sunstein spent several years as the head of President Obama's White House Office of Information. And judging from the state of his office, he doesn't seem to be a great candidate for information management. But of course, we know that information management is a major theme of the ITHAKA studies. And of course, like all the other categories of the findings, what the ITHAKA studies found was the practices of most scholars and scientists are highly idiosyncratic. They hardly conform to a pattern. And from that perspective, we might say Sunstein is typical. I mean, my office looks more like that than anything else, and I suspect a lot of you will observe the same thing on campuses. But again, I'm following Roger Schoenfeld's, the path he takes to identifying where the researchers are. And we want to show you one more slide. That's Jill Lepore, the phenomenal historian who's everywhere these days, in the New Yorker, Atlantic, and with new books on American history. And that's a picture of her at home. She lives in a 3-story house in Cambridge, and she works at home all that she can, largely because she says that she can't work without her dogs around, and that she takes periodic breaks to track them down in the house. Now, that may sound like a quirk, and to a degree it is, but as we read, or certainly as I read the ITHAKA reports, what I see are signs of all odd little corners of scholarly and scientific work with requirements for research practices that I'll name later as unofficial rather than official. So I'll refer to this slide later. There are 9 ITHAKA reports now, as most of you know, and it's in the environment we're in, with so much attention to student debt and questions of free speech and declines in public confidence in higher education. It's amazing that ITHAKA has given attention to another important problem. It doesn't seem like a high priority outside of the university, but ITHAKA has been relentless in directing us to questions of research practices. And I'm quoting from one in 2017 that Roger Schoenfeld did with Danielle Collins. The context and practices of research in higher education are in great flux. Scholars are not only confronting new technologies that redefine every aspect of their research activity, from discovering to organizing to disseminating information, but they must also contend with the economic restructuring of the academy. As research activity evolves, so too must the services and spaces that are provided to foster those activities. That's from 2017. You'll see an oddity of the chronology of the ITHAKA reports. There's a gap between 2014 and 2017, and that's when the ITHAKA staff switched in the organization and the doing of the reports. The first 3 were done by ITHAKA staff. They did all the interviewing, the writing, but beginning in 1917, ITHAKA began collaborating with libraries. And since then, all of the reports represent now collaborations between libraries and the ITHAKA staff. Now, viewed together, the reports represent a unique collective portrait. If you will, you might even call it a database of scholars and scientists at work, loyal to conventions but encountering new tools, often requiring assistance in using them. The studies codify what is on the minds of researchers and how librarians can help them to overcome impediments to what they want to achieve in their research, from discovery to dissemination. In effect, and this is the key point for us, ITHAKA challenges the view, often expressed in the studies themselves, that researchers have little to learn from librarians. I find it extraordinary how candid the ITHAKA reports are in reporting the attitudes of scholars and their indifference to libraries and the work of librarians. It took a lot for them to do that, but it gives the studies a lot of credibility precisely because they're willing to acknowledge that and work through it with the subjects of the views. You might have noticed, too, that the librarian interviewers, the librarians who do the studies, don't ask the scholars directly by libraries. They wait for the subject to come up. And for many of the interviewees, it doesn't come up. Or if it does, it comes up on neutral or sometimes even hostile or indifferent tones. Okay. So we have now the 9 studies, but the studies need to be seen in the context of great volatility in the scholarly communications world. Some of you saw the piece by Dan Cohn a few months ago in The Atlantic. Cohn ran the Digital Library of America for some time before moving over to Boston University as a professor of history and the university librarian. That's an unusual combination at universities, a faculty member running the library. And it's an important one in his case. He speaks with unusual authority about the questions of the ITHAKA studies. And what he discovered, of course, is rapidly declining rates of withdrawal at research university libraries. One of his best examples is, of all places, University of Virginia, which has had precipitous drops in withdrawals from the library. And of course, what Cohn is interested in is the question of the monograph and what this suggests about the reading of monographs, and then, of course, the writing of monographs. So from one side, we see signs of great uneasiness in the scholarly world. At the same time, some of you may have seen a study that came out a few years ago about the scholarly practices of sociologists. The early career sociologists now are publishing at twice the rate they published 20 years ago. Now, that refers largely to the writing of articles. So I mention these two examples to suggest that the pressures from different sides on the scholarly world. We see very unwelcome signs in sectors of publishing. I mean, you don't need to be told that. At the same time, there is more vitality and productivity than ever in some fields. And you've probably noticed that Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press just put out a report a month or two ago on the fate of the monograph. Now, they have an obvious interest in the monograph, in the thriving of monographs, but they never would have done the report had they not sensed the threat in the air to that form of scholarship. And one important point they make is how many scholars they found who claim to think through the monograph as a format in their cognitive lives. So I've mentioned these examples only to suggest the atmosphere in which these Ithaca reports are done. These are the 9 reports. The last 2 came out this year, and thus far they are in the top 10 of Ithaca's views, both with over 3,000 views. So plainly there's a readership, or maybe more accurately, a viewership for these reports, because we never really know what it means to, what does a view mean? It's not quite a download or a read, but there is substantial, it's fair to say there's substantial attention to the Ithaca reports. Danielle Collins Cooper at Ithaca told us that she's worked now with 102 libraries and 195 librarians over the course of the years since they switched the format to working with libraries. And the views are substantial. But there's also, I mentioned before that the Ithaca project might can be conceived as a database, because you may notice as you read the reports that in the footnotes are buried recognition of local reports done by many of the libraries and institutions who participate in the national project with Ithaca. So there are dozens of local reports on that the librarians wrote themselves about the conditions of their institutions. And what Ithaca does is sort of cream the data that comes in and work with maybe 30 or 40% of the interviews to write the national reports, and the local reports are left to the libraries. And there's a very large literature of local reports making up what it's fair to call a database on research practices that are campus specific. And of course, they may contain the most useful kinds of information for practicing librarians at those libraries. Now, what's also coming along now is a scholarly literature written by librarians in journals based on the Ithaca study. You'll see if you pick up the reference list we have here, you'll see 3 studies have come out in the past year or so in agriculture, public health, and engineering from librarians in academic journals about one feature or another. Why don't you wait with those, Jim? I'll put them out at the end. Yeah, okay. Too many years in the classroom with giving out handouts and then losing the audience. Yeah, okay. And that adds to the literature, and there's no question more work like that will be coming out. So we thought we would just summarize in 2 slides what we take to be where is that going? So why isn't this working? What? Go ahead. Okay. Now, here? Oh, I want to get the next one, right? Yep. Okay, okay. We asked this question first: what makes the ITHAKA studies timely and valuable? And I just want to get a quick comment on. These are all on paper copies, so you don't have to photograph anything. All right. These all are worth comments here. These are what we believe to be the what makes the ITHAKA report so valuable. But there's something to say about each of these. For example, a discipline by discipline focus is a big feature of the reports. The problem, of course, is that the most interesting differences may not be between disciplines, but within them. And that's one of the important features of reports, that it's very hard to generalize across a whole discipline when people practice it so differently. So the discipline by discipline focus is a good place to start, but where we wind up may be very different, focusing on the differences within disciplines. The reports record the digital transformation of research and scholarly communication. To a degree, that's the case because the subject of the first one was the movement, the digital humanities movement, and its impact on historians. And there's traces of a focus on digitalization throughout the studies that follow. But it was a quirk of how the whole series started. And this is a particular, for me at least, interesting category, because if you know of the work of Diane Harley and others at UC Berkeley, also working on a Mellon grant, they came up, when they published their report, it's several years ago now, came out with a very ambivalent statement about the fate of research strategies, and they found much more resistance, reluctance, and even resistance, the faculty, to digital transformation. Stuart Brand, the old Whole Earth catalog, he had a button he used to circulate early in this century, and it simply said, "Not so fast." And I think that's the UC Berkeley studies are in that mode. Diane Harley published a terrific piece in Science on why she thought we were overestimating the rapidity with which scholars and scientists were moving towards digital experience. And we still see signs of that. Some of the ethnographic studies at Cornell, for instance, and scholars in other locations, several in Europe, who actually visit faculty offices and observe people sitting in front of computers with books open and paper out, spreading themselves across the digital and the analog world in ways that don't often show up in interview research or survey research, that observing scholars yields something a little different than we see. The surveys, the interviews, though, are an important complement to survey research, and they claim to be scholar-centered. This is as important as anything else in what the reports do. And I think on the reference list is a terrific scholarly kitchen blog post from Letty Conrad about how she understands what scholar-centered means. And one thing that impressed me is the way she talks about awareness of what scholars do and compassion for research information practices. That's a very odd term to encounter in this context. But her attention to compassion, that is, to build some deep personal understanding of what a scholarly vocation is all about, I think even comes through the ITHAKA studies. And the case Letty Conrad makes is for integrating, making this approach to studying the faculty sustainable, and to a degree that will depend on the level of the level of affect that can be achieved in doing this, in doing interview research. So anyway, well, let me go back up here. Okay. Finally, there's the question of the organization of interactions between scholars and academic libraries. Talking yesterday with Roger Schoenfeld, we found we agreed, and if nothing else happened as a result of these studies, they have produced hundreds of encounters between scholars and scientists and librarians, which would never have come about had it not been for these studies. And that's a substantial achievement. I mean, it's hard to record it. Let's say we can count the number of interviews, but what we don't have a record of course, is how many of these are sustainable and have led to activities and sort of secondary encounters of other things. So over the course of the 9 studies, this has been an important contribution. How many interactions they've produced between scholars and libraries. We're going to leave the list of what we have learned simply to the statements we've here. This is on one of the handout sheets. You can take it. We're not going to comment on this because this is a fairly predictable set of what research practices need attention. Now, what we did was we went over the 9 studies and produced a spreadsheet. It has the main categories of what practices need attention, and then there's a column for each of the disciplines, and we marked how much attention this report gave to one or another practices, and we filled out the naming of the research practices. So there's a spreadsheet here that gives you if you have the patience for it and your bifocals are working, it gives you a tour of the 9 studies and the many different research practices that they actually name. The problem, of course, is this adds up to an image of the all-purpose librarian. And you'll recognize the many, many things that the reports urge on libraries. Okay, which brings us to the end, in my part anyway, to the what should we do part. And I would have a short list here. I'm leaning on Letty Conrad and her blog post on institutionalizing attention to researcher experience. What she argues is that librarians should look at the research they do on the faculty the same way they look at all their other investments and expenditures. It's as important as staffing or anything else, space considerations. It's as important as anything else libraries do. Now, she doesn't name the ethical reports, but what she has in mind is a continuing effort of this kind, that libraries should give as much priority they do to all the other ways they estimate their activities, allocate their resources, make claims for funds on the university, and so on. So a certain kind of sustainability is what she urges. Embracing idiosyncrasy and recognizing context. Those two things it's a bit of an oxymoron buried there. That is great particularity and great breadth. But that's what's necessary in understanding the research practices. Jill Lepore with her dog is as good an example as you can get of idiosyncratic research practices. Let's say, at the same time, recognizing the battle over the monograph is a crucial part of the context of scholarly work in many fields right now. I've included road shows and house calls because I'm at a big university, and we have lots of centralized activities. And I find again and again those who lead them are frustrated by the lack of recognition of the faculty of what they're trying to do. We have a big new tech innovation center, but you never see them in they work on their websites and then they keep their fingers crossed that the teaching faculty is going to come to them for help on teaching. I think in some cases this is what happens with libraries too. They build terrific programs, work very hard on the website, but they don't turn up in the office of the chairs of departments to find out, tell me on your faculty who needs help with this, or how often can I come over? Give me 15 minutes at a department meeting. Whatever. It's what I mean by road shows and house calls. That is, mobility matters in this regard, and going directly to the faculty on this, I think, is one way to break this sort of cycle of just wishing that something would happen and the faculty would turn up more at the library. It's very tough work, and observing what the reports call for in specialized knowledge by librarians, it just knocked me out. I mean, in the hopes that ITHAKA has for librarians. It's difficult, but I think going out is the way to do it. 2 more things. One is to seek partnerships. These are quirky ways. One way to find an audience for help on the dissemination side is to work with the Office of Research Administration. All of the grants that come into university are registered publicly. It's very easy to find out who's just won big grants and thus who is operating within the mandate for open access publishing. That's a good way to build an audience of clients, is via collaborating with the Office of Research Administration. I think because those are people who are going to have to change their ways and could use the help of librarians in doing so. And I would not neglect the graduate schools either. Many of the reports feature, the reports don't set out to study graduate students, but many of the faculty members who are interviewed reveal how much they rely on graduate students. So I think focusing on graduate students for some of these efforts is a smart way to get to the faculty. It's indirect, but many faculty members recognize how much they learn from their graduate students. So I wouldn't neglect the graduate schools either. And finally, Jennifer and I wanted to urge you to aim for small wins. And that's because we're both big fans of an essay by the social psychologist Carl Weick. The back of one of these sheets has several paragraphs from Weick. And one of the things he does is urge all reformers to lower the temperature a little. People often define problems in ways that overwhelm their ability to do anything about them. To recast larger problems into smaller, less arousing problems, people can identify a series of controllable opportunities, fabulous phrase, controllable opportunities of modest size that produce visible results and that can be gathered into synoptic solutions. So the way to think about this would be, if you look on that spreadsheet that we give you, is to find one or two things that look doable and focus on those. A small win, let's say, and then take some comfort in the synoptic solution that's spread across institutions. And if you see the ITHAKA studies as a national project that altogether adds up to progress in several categories, that's probably a much more fruitful way to recognize its contribution rather than to focus on what any one individual might do with a small staff of liaisons in the library and so on. So the small wins approach, we think, is a very practical one. Jennifer's going to cover the librarian's perspective.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And I want to just echo the thanks for Roger. When I started my graduate work at Michigan State, which was how I got to know Steve, I was thinking to myself, is anyone asking for a faculty perspective on what they are seeing, what they want from the libraries? And lo and behold, yes, we were. The ITHAKA studies were there. So that was my introduction to them. And I also want to thank Steve, because he's the kind of scholar that we want to work with. When I got into class, when I identified myself as a librarian, it was like, ooh, he was interested, and we had a lot of great conversations. And something that he would often remind me or say to me is, librarians are so focused on operations. And I thought a lot about that because, yes, it's true, and there is a lot that we're facing. And looking at the ITHAKA studies, I thought it was interesting to contrast another ITHAKA study that we have available to us, and that's the ITHAKA US study, the US study of US libraries. For those of you who may be deans or directors, you may have an invitation in your inbox right now to take the latest survey. The new version will be coming out. But right now, we can look at the 2016 survey and get a sense of the sort of things we're looking at. So when I think about recognizing context and looking at the recommendations of the ITHAKA report, those come to my mind too, and I'm certainly hearing it across the conference this year. So this idea that we are in a position where all politics are local. Even though we've got lots of research, we know the larger landscape, a lot of times we've got to focus on what's right in front of us, and we've got to focus on making sure that we're meeting the mission of our institutions. I was really struck a couple of years ago at an ALA conference presentation by Constance Malpas, and looked at some of what we know is coming at us in terms of higher ed, where we're going to be, and already are, struggling for enrollment, facing declining revenues, and that institutions were going to be looking to get the most out of all of their resources, including their human resources, including their library human resources. So that's always on my mind. But before I talk about either of the study, I'm just true confession time. When Steve said, these ITHAKA reports are amazing, librarians, are you reading them? And I said, well, you can raise your hand if you're like me. I flipped to the page where it says, do they still need us? Okay, yes, it didn't creep up that much. And then I read the executive summary and I think I'm gonna come back to this, but it's very easy to get busy with what we're doing. So I think, as Steve said, scholars aren't necessarily giving these the attention that there's more there for them. There's more there for us, too, as librarians. But thinking about the US Library Survey, I just wanted to bring up a couple of highlights that I noted in the surveys to help us think about, just to remind ourselves. I think another thing that I appreciate that ITHAKA does is it documents these things, and we know that we are part of an ecosystem, we're not alone. So in surveying the library deans and directors, over 50% of us, I think the number was 55%, are still in our first 5 years as deans and directors. And so we've come in and we know the landscape is changing. We know that we've got to do what we can to align what we're doing with the missions of our institutions, and yet there's a lot to do, and I don't know about you all, I'm coming up on year 4, and I am still learning every day. So something I thought was really interesting, if you were a dean or a director and you'd been in your position for longer, you recognized a need for change, but technology was something that you identified as being a barrier to change. Whereas if you were like me and newer in your position, you saw working with staff as a barrier to change. So to me, that's interesting and something we're dealing with and something we have to think about as we think about centering the scholar and all of the different things that we do. I also want to note that a majority of us are saying that we are centering the student experience and particularly focusing on student success, and yet we are still struggling with proving what exactly we do. It's hard for us to measure how are we impacting that student success, although we know somehow we are. We're all struggling with dwindling budgets, and that may be contributing to a larger sense that what we are doing to align our work with the broader campus mission maybe isn't measuring up or isn't being recognized by our upper administration. And we also are looking at staff. When we have opportunities to reorganize, we do, and we're focusing more and more on staff who are dealing directly with research assistance and instruction. So it can seem to be sort of a bleak picture, but I think it's not really. It's to say, hey, we're all working on this. Again, appreciating that ITHAKA is bringing these issues to the fore. We have something documented that we can work with. And so coming to the, I flip back to the recommendations that Steve has, because he had said to me, is this realistic? This is what I see as a scholar, as a faculty member. How does this track with libraries? And I saw a lot there that is happening, but could happen more. And sitting at a conference like this, where we are very much centering the material, it just occurs to me that many of the conversations that I have with people in my libraries, when we talk about centering the user, it's centering the student. It isn't always centering the scholars and the researchers, and that they are a smaller group, that there is an opportunity for us to be strategic in working with them. And so that idea of embracing idiosyncrasy, I think many of us might be familiar with the work that the ARL, the Association of Research Libraries, is doing on the changing role of the library liaison. Because it seems to me that that is a role that certainly has a lot of opportunity to embrace idiosyncrasy and to be going out and doing the road shows and house calls that Steve has talked about, and many still are. I think back to Charleston from some years ago when Rick Anderson talked about the starfish story, about the person on the beach and they'd pick up a starfish and throw it back, and how it made a big difference to that starfish, but that wasn't scalable. It wasn't a way to build a library program, when we were talking about different things in libraries. And I hope I'm getting Rick right there. But we all have to have places in our operation where maybe what is good for that one starfish is the place that we focus on. Those small stories, those anecdotes are small wins. And so I would argue that liaisons are definitely feeling, as we know from the research, that they keep adding more, but we don't take anything away. And that time, communication, meeting faculty where they are, finding them where they are, and scaling what they do are difficult. And I guess I would just argue that maybe scalability isn't the place in our liaison. There needs to be a place in the library where scale isn't always what we're working on. That maybe we do that in our collections, but when we talk about centering scholars, we worry less about scale and more about how do we reach them where they are and look for those small wins. So looking at time, I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I don't know if Steve has anything more to ask, but otherwise we'd be glad to take any questions you might have.
Protests are fine, too.
Yes. Agree, disagree? Come on up. Yeah, the microphone should be on in the middle there. I understand they're recording sessions, so it helps everyone to hear, and I think it helps for the record as well to come to the mic.
Great. Just a quick question first. Thank you for a really great and fascinating presentation. I'm James Castanides, Yale Library. Just wondering about the first round of reports, the ones that were pre-2017.
Right.
What are your thoughts on, how those might be revisited in terms of what they revealed and what in the intervening now 5 years might have changed?
A lot has happened technologically, certainly. And the first of them, I guess, there are probably new things to. There are probably new things to say about the first, especially because it did take up the question of the digital humanities, which in 2012 looked like it was going to overwhelm certainly English departments, and if not get beyond it. Some of you know there's been a considerable reaction to it, and the things don't look as promising, quite as promising as they did in 2012. So at some point, it will be useful to go back and look at the form of that report. Of course, it focused on historians, which were, not the primary target, at least. Most of the work in digital humanities was in English departments. But at some point, it would probably be useful to go back. Now, I hate to do this, but Roger Schoenfeld is sitting here. I wonder if he would comment himself on and if there are any plans to go back to the earliest reports. There are. I promised you I wouldn't do this, but I couldn't resist. The question demanded it, all right? It actually is great. We get a chance to recognize Roger, too, for all that he's done for this.
That's so kind of you. Let me just say, first of all, how uncanny it is to sit in the back of the room for a presentation like this about the work that my colleagues and I have taken on. Let me just say thank you very much for taking this on yourself. Oh, I'm not close enough. I'm so sorry. I'm thanking them, just to be clear. We have not yet thought about going back to the earlier reports because it feels like there's still dozens of fields that we haven't touched yet with this method. And that said, if there's demand to do it, it's been a very we've gone opportunistically after the fields that we've selected. I think that's an important thing to say, rather than with any terrible sophistication about how to do it. So we're open to guidance about fields that libraries and other sponsors might be interested in pursuing. We have a study of languages and literatures coming out in I believe in January is when it will be released. Modern languages and literatures, and then we're turning to data science is
Wow,
the next field. So yeah, but happy to consider going back as well. Yeah. And thank you.
Other comments? Now, Betsy Chang is here from NC State. Do I have your name right? Bertha, excuse me. She gave a terrific presentation yesterday on the North Carolina State ITHAKA project, and NC State is a terrific example of an institution that has taken the format and run with it and did their own local study that reflected the sort of the method and the ethos of the ITHAKA studies, but focused on some allied questions, and the result was an incredibly impressive array of sort of a reconceptualization of the way the library at NC State offered its services to the faculty. It was very impressive, and it's sort of a different vocabulary, so to speak, but a consistent one across different categories of research activity. You want to say a word about that, how that came about? Or? The website is very rich and worth a look. Go ahead.
Yes, so, is this working? So it ended up by happenstance that we were one of the universities participating in the study on civil and environmental engineers, but I had a couple of colleagues who were also interested in studying campus researchers to see how the libraries could meet their needs. And so the ITHAKA local study happened first. My colleagues then took the basis of the ITHAKA study and modified that to match their study, and were able to get a lot of really rich insights onto researchers, and that has really helped us to see how we can meet our researchers' needs. So the ones that are not met, we can develop new service areas, but there are also plenty of areas where they thought we did not have anything to provide, but we did. And so it's like, how can we develop new outreach methods to make them a bit, aware of what the libraries has to offer? But the ITHAKA study was really the basis for helping us to carry out that second study.
No, I think if you, oh, what's happening? No? If you go to the NC, if you, well, this one isn't on either. Okay. Took a power hit. By the time the audio guy turns up, let's just speak loud. Yes, go ahead, I'm sorry. The audio went off.
Oh, I have a loud voice.
Good.
Is there any a body of studies or particular articles you can point us to regarding libraries' response to the ITHAKA studies? And I'm thinking of, it would probably boil down to case studies, or how particular libraries have taken the information from the ITHAKA studies.
Perfect, yeah. There are 3 studies on this list. You'll see from the titles.
Okay.
They're done by librarians. They're in technical, specialized journals in their fields. But what they've done, these librarians, is take a feature of their ITHAKA project and probe it and give it a lot of visibility. My favorite example in this group is a piece by, so I can find it, by a group of public health librarians at the University of Illinois. And they got very interested in the question of gray literature. I was very struck by this. They thought the interviews, but if you read the ITHAKA report on the public health, gray literature is just one category. It turns up here in the piece they did for the journal that gray literature is as important as anything else to public health scholars. And it's obvious why that's the case, because they work with so many agencies, nonprofits. There's a lot of other kinds of texts to read. So, I mean, they would never have gotten to the point of promoting librarians' roles in connecting the faculty to gray literature had they not participated in the ITHAKA studies. And there are 2 other reports, one on agriculture scholars and open access. Open access is a big theme in the reports, but to them, that was as big an issue as anything else. So there were 3 examples of librarians who are responding, as you would put it, to the ITHAKA research, but with an accent on a feature of the national overall report that struck them as particularly salient on their campus. That's why when I talk about the ITHAKA studies as, in effect, a database, if you think about all the local reports, you see a lot underlining and accenting and saying, hey, this is really important. There's a group in Kansas that published a piece in Portal about but the need for attention to what they call the street beat in looking at research practices. And it's a nice phrase to describe being local and paying attention to what's going on the campus. And these 3 reports show that, yes, the ITHAKA national study is valuable and tells us something about public health scholars, across the country, or at least at all the libraries that they studied with. But in each case, there was a campus saying, oh, here's the thing that really is on our minds, or most our scholars were particularly interested in. So you do see a response there. Now, all these came out in the last year or 2, and remember, the new round of reports based on interviews with librarians only started 2 years ago. So given the pace of things, I suspect we'll see many more of these studies too. It's also very gratifying to see these as examples of librarian scholarship too. That the participating in the ITHAKA accounts opened up scholarly opportunities for librarians to talk about research practices in very particular ways with a good body of data that there's no way they would have had access to, or probably would not have generated on their own, let's say, without the authority that came with being asked to participate or volunteering or joining with ITHAKA and doing it. I think it's because it's otherwise hard to get the support to get that many scholars to participate, to dedicate the time of the staff, and so on. So a lot of good things have come from this, but a lot of the best things are local, apart from the most visible national reports. So another comment? Yes, go ahead.
Apart from studying the field of chemistry and civil and environmental
Right.
engineering, do you have a view as far as field of studies is concerned? Have you given up on the sciences, or what about, or are you thinking of also studying computer science and math?
Yeah, well, I think Roger just noted they have there's a study in the works on computer science. Yeah, and actually up to this point, over the 9 studies, there's a good distribution across the humanities, social science, and the sciences. There's a whole report on the chemists and on the engineers. Roger, did you want to add to that?
I don't think the mic is working. I'm sorry. I'll only add that we're constantly adding to our plans for the next couple of years for the research side, data science, as I mentioned before, computer science, engineering, and we're also doing
Check, 1, 2.
if anyone's interested, we want this to be an inclusive community-driven process. So, don't feel comfortable. I don't want to do this program, but I'd be happy to talk to anyone about participating.
Are we there? Another comment or two, a question? You've been very patient with the technical. I'm worried that I caused the problem, that the mics and everything absorbed my technological ambivalence and refused to perform as a sort of, to spite me on this. But
He's more tech savvy than he gives himself
I'll deal with them privately on this. Thank you.